you so much for everybody for coming. It's great to see the list of people who've arrived. Nice representation from the School of Ed. Hello, everybody, and people from other walks of Brookes. So thank you very much for coming. And I'm really looking forward to having this hour of discussion, hopefully with as little as possible of me talking and mostly just discussion and questions. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now, which means I can't see anybody, but feel free to unmute to laugh at all the jokes and nod along, and we'll get going. So if there are any issues with what you can see, feel free to just give me a shout. And I'm pretty sure there should be no windows popping up, but if my wife texts me to say pick up milk or something like that, then forgive any intrusions. No children in the house today, so it should be seamless, I'm sure. Okay. So without further ado, Roger, if you could just let me know that you can see the screen, everything's going okay?
Yeah, that's displaying fine, Patrick.
Fantastic. Okay, so the title of the talk for today is Schools Out Forever, the Future of Schooling After the Pandemic. And what I'd like to do in this talk is to explore important questions raised for mass education and specifically state schooling in the wake of COVID-19. With mass education going online for the first time and with high stakes examinations cancelled across the world in summer 2020, schooling is entering a new and unprecedented era. With reference to my new book, and shameless plug, Schooling and Social Identity, I'll explore the history of schooling and its structure to think critically about what the future of schools may look like after coronavirus. And there is Alice Cooper as, I'm not sure when that's from, but author of that classic 1972 Schools Out on the album Schools Out from Warner Brothers. We'll come back to Alice a bit later on. So really, these are questions that have fascinated me for more than 10 years, and it feels like such an important time to be asking them again. So really, what I'd like to do in the next 20 minutes is just to ask three questions. One is to ask that simple but often overlooked question, why do we send children to school? What are schools for? Why is it that they've become such a taken for granted part of social life in broadly in Western societies, but mostly across the world? What conditions define schooling in the present? And I want to particularly explore this idea of kind of the rapacious uncertainty of the present, but also the kind of persistent the persistent preoccupation with certainty that we have in the context of schooling, and to think about a few different aspects of why it is that happens and what allows it to continue. This kind of tension between uncertainty and certainty. And then to ask the question, what conditions define the future of schooling? So in this moment, this kind of moment of pivot that we have, what kinds of things might we start to think about in terms of the future of schooling? What radical things might we start to challenge about the nature of schooling? And therefore to ask, is school out forever? Is it just out for fever? Are we going to go back to it? And then to think about what kinds of ways what kinds of ideas we might use to try and articulate what schooling could be, hopefully leaving lots of time for Q&A after that. Okay, so the first question, it's a big question, and the book that I recently put out, which is, I'll show you in a second, is mainly kind of preoccupied with this question of why we send children to school and why do we do it in the way that we do. So in very crude terms, I think we can kind of we can run over a couple of different things that schooling's for beyond just teaching people stuff. And I think all the way through the concept of schooling, you can see this kind of underlying tension. So on one hand, the noun school, the school with sort of Greek and Latin roots. I think this is a Merriam-Webster definition: leisure, philosophy, lecture place. Effectively a place of learning, a place ultimately of enlightenment. That's what schools can do. But the verb to school means to discipline, to train, to make tractable. And I feel like, especially in the context of mass schooling, we see this underlying tension between the two different intentions of schooling. So I think we can see schooling historically as a place for learning, particularly if we think about mass education in England as a good example of this, that schooling has been for learning, but it's been for learning of a very particular time, and historically schools have been preoccupied with a kind of transmission idea of learning, that older, wiser adults can confer knowledge to younger people. and they gain that knowledge and they develop, but they have a particular way of developing, and the idea of development that we often see in schooling is from developmental psychology and suggests a kind of linear, irreversible track that young people develop on towards some kind of stable state of adulthood way off in the distance. So historically, we can see those two things as being what schooling's for. Schooling is also for socialization. So from Durkheim to Marx to Foucault to everybody in between, I think there's some consensus there that schooling offers a hidden or not so hidden curriculum through which we are socialized into norms, beliefs, values, particular ideological points of view, particular discourses that we ultimately embody and that become part of who we are. And when we're thinking about mass education, schooling within the context of the nation state, then schooling is certainly about socialization into citizenship. So it's into a kind of a sense of morality, a sense of civic identity that hopefully everybody shares from one perspective. Schooling is also for cultural transmission, and it's nice to see some anthropologists here in the room. So we could argue that schooling historically has been about cultural transmission, but of a particular kind. So this idea that culture is a thing that often exists in the minds and in the practices of elders, and then is transmitted whole to younger people who then take it in, and then later down the line they transmit it again. So this sense of kind of culture as a kind of discrete thing that doesn't change in the process of learning. Often that's what schooling is assumed to be about. It's about, and again going back to the idea of schooling in the nation state, that this somehow protects or stewards some sense of cultural homogeneity. Schooling is also about skills. Bowles and Gintis, lots of other sociologists have argued this, the idea obviously that schooling is where we learn what we need to be valuable in the workforce, that long shadow of work that trains us up, and we can go to a quote from Michelle Donnelly to see the same thing about university a bit later on. So schooling is about skills, and schooling is also historically ultimately about structure. It's about social and cultural reproduction. It's about socializing people into ideas about hierarchy, and I would argue fundamentally it's about socializing people into a generational or even gerontological hierarchy, this idea that age is a taken for granted structure in society, and that's something that we mainly experience through schooling. It socializes us into asymmetries of power, especially around class, and mass education is a fundamental part of the architecture of the nation state. I think it's fair to argue that the modern nation state would be much harder to sustain if you didn't have a context like school, where you can socialize people into a shared sense of national identity. So schooling as a state apparatus, or as a disciplinary institution, or as a locus for consensus, depending on which side of the sociological fence you sit on. Certainly schooling historically has also been about future orientation, and that's something that I want to talk about in a bit more detail in a minute. So this idea that school is where we start to learn to think about a very particular kind of future, and to constantly imagine ourselves in the present inhabiting that future, and getting to grips with the idea that schooling and then things later down the line are the processes that we need to go through in order to arrive at that future. Last but not least, schooling is also about emancipation. It's about empowerment, it's about enlightenment, it can be about agency, in spite of a lot of those other historical conditions that have characterized schooling for the last 150 years or so. And I think all of us have a teacher in mind who was the person who allowed us to engage with schooling in a way that opened our eyes, that broadened our horizons, and probably meant that we ended up sitting in this room today rather than doing something else. So I think that's a kind of a very crude, quick list of why we normally send children to school, and explaining these points. Sometimes I would say, one way that we can take for granted, that we can realize how taken for granted the importance of schooling is to do a kind of little imagination exercise where we think about where all 15-year-olds are right now. And on a normal day, you would say, well, they're all in school. Obviously now we don't know, and that's one of the exciting things to explore. But I think that's a kind of a reasonable summary of why we send children to school from a kind of sociological and historical perspective. So then the next question becomes, what conditions define schooling in the present? So I think we can see in the present of schooling a continuation of that original tension between the idea that schools are emancipatory, that historically they've been about reform, they've been about equality, they've been about giving everybody the same chance to kind of develop their potential, but also they are places of social control, and even the idea of developing potential arguably is a form of social control. So obviously some things have changed about schooling. And Roger, I think weirdly, the guy on the top right there kind of looks a bit like you from a distance.
Must be me.
But I mean, so from these pictures, obviously you can see that certain things have changed, but also certain things haven't changed. And I think to me, that is the most arresting, fascinating thing about schooling, is that really, in lots of ways, it hasn't changed a lot in the last century and a half, even though some things obviously have. So what has changed? I think schooling in the present obviously is influenced by a childhood-centered pedagogy, and I've specifically said childhood rather than child-centered pedagogy because I think contemporary pedagogy is focused on a particular conceptualization of childhood, which is about empowerment, it's about rights, it's about agency, but often schools are quite hard places to enact the principles of a childhood-centered pedagogy. So sometimes there's a distinction between a child-centered pedagogy and a childhood-centered pedagogy, one that focuses on that kind of idea. But schools are about equity, they can be about student voice, they can be about obviously radically different forms of pedagogy from a kind of straightforward chalk and talk transmission model. And obviously things like technology have changed, and we're in a moment of kind of radical change in terms of the space and the nature of learning. But I think, like I say, some things have remained remarkably similar over the last 150 years. One of the most profound things that stays the same is this idea of future orientation, that schools are a place where we're socialized into thinking about the future. We're constantly thinking about the future when we're at school, because so many of the activities that take place at school are about some kind of future productivity, future achievements, future sort of goal orientation. I think oftentimes, and we can see this in the kind of audit culture of mass education, that learning is still to a large extent about transmission, that cultures of examination or rites of passage of examination often err towards the side of transmission learning, in the sense that you need to learn certain things to pass within the parameters of an exam. It's not necessarily about knowledge or intelligence. And I think broadly, and especially in the current moment, we can see that schooling in lots of cases continues to be about the entrenchment of educational inequalities, that in spite of the best efforts of thousands of teachers around the world, schooling often reproduces inequalities for young people and doesn't do what it promises. It doesn't provide meritocracy. So more often provides the myth of it in spite of people's best efforts. And I think we can see that with the kind of expansion of mass education into other international contexts. So, for example, factory schooling in India at the moment, as an example of how those educational inequalities can be kind of perpetuated by schooling. So I think overall we can see this kind of enduring tension between on one hand, school is a place where people are controlled, where they're disciplined, where they're made tractable, but increasingly where schooling is also about a discourse of agency, of child-centered pedagogy, and there is this tension about how you're able to provide an emancipatory context for young people, while at the same time doing so in a context that is orchestrated around the total control of adults. And also this interesting tension between certainty as a thing that is in the fabric of schooling, this idea that we're working towards a future that will exist, and uncertainty out there in the world. And we're in this fascinating but slightly terrifying moment of rapacious uncertainty. And I want to kind of dig into those points in a bit more detail. So this uncertainty isn't anything new, and I think over the last 10 years across 4 or 5 different projects, I've been able to track different forms of uncertainty and the kind of the growing uncertain nature of the world in which schools are situated. So Kerry Facer at Bristol makes a strong argument for for thinking about the world as VUCA, which is a military term from the first Iraq invasion/war. And that stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's basically the logic for kind of preemptive strikes, that the world is crazy, so if you do something first, you can make it less crazy. But when you think about it, in the last 4 years, we've seen so much evidence of a world that is kind of turned upside down in terms of predictability, in terms of ecology, in terms of political systems, in terms of economics, and now in terms of the current coronavirus context. So it really is so much less easy to think about what might happen tomorrow today, and that things that are seemingly surreal, like Donald Trump becoming president of the United States, or any number of different things that have happened in the last 4 to 5 years, they can happen. Exams can stop, schools can close, everyone can stay home. We live in this moment where uncertainty is extremely rapacious. And of course, that has big implications for young people anticipating what they might do with their lives, what they might do next. And yet, interestingly, if anything, we see across different phases of education, but particularly in relation to schooling, this kind of thriving of a discourse of certainty, which I think is fundamental to the broader project of the modern nation state. Right? You have to be able to convince people that things are certain, or we have to share a sense of certainty in order to have any kind of faith in the systems that our present is organized around. So the anthropologist Peter Pells has made this really interesting argument that actually when we think about the future, we're only thinking about one version of the future. So we call it the future, but it's actually just an idea. It's not a real thing. It's not a kind of pre-existing dimension of physics. It's not an element of time that is inevitable. It's an idea that we think about, and that in thinking about it, we bring it into existence. And so his argument is that actually when we think about the future, really what we're often doing is a kind of futurology. And bizarrely, because this is in the context of the modern nation state and in the context of modernity, we're often thinking about a future, or we're socialized to think about a future that, number one, never existed. And if it ever were to have existed, it would have existed sometime in the middle of the 20th century. And the future I'm talking about is the one that, that is kind of reflected in those pictures. This idea that, if you work hard at school, then you might be able to get serious and go to university, and ultimately you might get that job that pays off the dividends, to use the parlance of our current minister's recent speech, so that you can then exist in that life that you've been trained to orient towards. So in a strange way, that concept of the future kind of colonizes the present. And that's where we see that future orientation in schools, this idea that we're constantly leaning towards a future. And you can even see that in something like mindfulness, right? So mindfulness is practiced in schools, and so we focus on being present, but actually the end goal of mindfulness is to become a better person, a more mindful person that exists not in the present, but in some kind of yet to be experienced future. So and that happens in a kind of everyday subtle way, and it makes research about futures, about imagined futures, quite not straightforward, but it's very exciting to do in schools, because so much of the time that people spend talking to each other is about this kind of imagining of the future, about narrating the future, about saying, oh, when I've done this, I can become that. When I've finally sent off my application letter, there'll be this version of me that will float out into the world, and then I can inhabit that future version of me. And so in lots of different ways, that imagining of the future is constrained by particular discourses of aspiration. And by that I mean, the things that we think we should do in order to live a meaningful life. So it doesn't get much important than this, I don't think. But we can only think about certain versions of the future if we are socialized into particular discourses of aspiration. So one way to think about this would be to think about aspiration as a kind of, in lots of ways, fundamentally neoliberal idea, in the way that it's presented to us through schooling and elsewhere. This idea that we are solely responsible for what happens to us, and that if we work hard, we'll be able to achieve certain kinds of things. And also this idea of meritocracy, right? That we should all be able to achieve everything that we want. But of course, the reality of an economic system that privileges competition is that the success of other people's is often predicated on the failure of others, and that's what Lauren Berlant argues is this concept of cruel optimism. You know, by saying you can do whatever you want, actually we're socializing people into something quite cruel, because in so many cases that hard work won't pay off in the way that people are kind of socialized to think about. So Zippin describes this as a kind of combination of different aspects of aspiration. On one hand, doxic aspiration, so this idea that we have kind of a natural sense of what is meaningful and how we get there. It's habituated in the sense that we think about it all the time. We're doing it all the time. I guess I'm probably doing it right now by doing a talk. It's dispositional. It becomes part of literally embodied in us. But also this idea of an emergent logic of aspiration, kind of emancipatory, novel, critical, a chink in the hegemony of aspiration as it's otherwise framed, and that fits into hopefully some kind of productive ideas that we can talk about in a second. I think genealogical framings of learning are also a really important part of framing aspiration, because ultimately that leads us to think about knowledge in a particular way. It leads us to think about learning in a particular way. The thing I was talking about before, that elders teach youngers, and that the knowledge kind of transfers down the line, and that through schooling we're socialized into this kind of generational structure of society that we then take with us wherever we go. Forever and a day you'll be class of 88 or 98 or 2008, but definitely not of 2020. So yeah, so these are themes that have come up in a range of different research projects that I've done over the last 10 years, and there's some links there to different projects. And I think in each one, this sense of tension between being socialized into certainty while living in uncertain times is a really powerful and difficult idea to try and wrestle with. So you think about, and these are just some images from some of those projects. So the top two from Bronx High School, the bottom three from schools around Oxfordshire, and to me that image of those offer letter of the results letters, which is what's there in the middle, those are A-level results envelopes, is extremely evocative. This idea that there are these moments where your future can suddenly change, and in the right-hand picture there's a girl just with a mobile in her hand, having called a university for clearing to strike a deal, and so suddenly in that moment her future went off in a different direction. So all of that leads me to some interesting questions about the current moment when schooling is it potentially really being shaken up. And so I want to just kind of raise these questions and then move through to the discussion. So why is it significant that exams were cancelled this year? So for me, the really fascinating thing about exams being cancelled is that it suggests a different possible route into the future. It suggests a different way into the life course. It's, I think, probably extremely traumatic for young people to have missed out on that rite of passage that concludes schooling. And obviously those feelings that come with that, feelings of guilt, probably feelings of uncertainty that their exams will be as valuable as other people's exams. But it also suggests that it can happen. And I don't think there's been a time when exams have been cancelled all over the world. And so the curtain's been lifted, and we can say, well, actually, if we're able to predict people's attainment, people's achievement, people's performance in a different way, maybe we don't need those exams anymore. Maybe at least we don't need to focus on them as much as we have been. Maybe there's another way. But I think always through these questions, it's important to remember 2008, because in 2008 we said, oh, look, the curtain's been lifted on global capitalism, and it turns out that it doesn't work as well as some people think. Maybe we should do something different. And people like Thomas Piketty would have made that argument. And here we are 12 years later with probably a more voracious form of that kind of neoliberal capitalism. So remember 2008. Schooling from home and learning at home. I think there's a really interesting thing has happened in the last 3 months about structures of learning. I feel like schooling from home is actually kind of like working from home. It's kind of the imposition of structures from elsewhere, that structures are ultimately about labor into your home context, whereas learning at home really opens things up. And I think there's a huge amount of interesting potential there to think about how we're able to capitalize, to use a crude term, on these opportunities for different ways of learning. So not thinking, so moving more towards the emancipatory possibilities of schooling and away from the role of schooling as a locus for docility, for control. What are the implications for age hierarchies? I think there are profound implications for moving away from the age hierarchy of schooling that has existed since the 1870s. Remarkably, that we can think about age, moving away from age as a kind of structure for education, which in turn has major implications for wider society. You know, what's to say that if you have online, you know, a primary, what would have been a primary 6 topic for learning some kind of a project-based activity that couldn't be accessed by people who are 10 and 15 and 25 and 35? Why is A-levels, you know, A-level biology broadly limited in schools to people of the kind of 16 to 18 age range, widely speaking? What ways might this help us to go back to Dewey's original idea of transmission as a kind of commoning of knowledge being the thing that occurs between people in the moment of learning, rather than kind of a different way of thinking about transmission, which is, you know, from one person to the next, often from older to younger. We might think about schooling for all, that schooling doesn't need to be about just young people, it should be for everybody all the time, and what kind of emancipatory possibilities there are for citizens if we think that learning becomes a much more formal part of our experience of everyday life. We might think about dissolving completely the phases of education. Why do we need a difference between primary and secondary and FE and HE? Why can't we just get rid of those now? That leads on to implications for universities. As I said before, Michelle Donnellan very recently said that you know, young people have been taken advantage of because they have the debt of an investment that didn't pay off. So if you need any evidence that we are in a moment where people still think about this kind of linear modern idea of the future as something that exists as a return on an investment in the present, there it is. And what are the implications for parenting? Obviously, not everybody can parent like Rousseau. There are major constraints, including working from home. But how might we think differently about parenting if the idea of if a lot of the learning that occurs in schooling is no longer outsourced, as it were? How might we think differently about parenting? So there are lots of questions there. And one way, I'll leave it here, maybe we can talk about this as we discuss, but one way of thinking about how we act on these questions is to think about futures literacy, which is something that's been developed by Riel Miller and UNESCO, but as a kind of a framework for not just thinking about that modern future that dominates in schooling and in wider society, but to think about the future as something more amorphous, more difficult to track, but more exciting because of that, and as something that is therefore very much anchored in our action in the present. And ultimately that will lead us to this question: what action do we take in the present that might mean that schooling as it has existed is out forever? Or is it just out for fever? Again, remember 2008. Is this just going to be something that occurs for a moment, and then we could return to an even more entrenched version of the schooling that we've had for the last 150 years? Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much. Just to remember, no more pencils, no more books, no more teachers' dirty looks. Out for summer, out till fall. We might not come back at all. School's out forever. School's out for summer. School's out with fever, prophetically. School's out completely. So thank you, finally, to Alice Cooper. Thanks.